Last year, we were honored to have Henry Kissinger as the World Jewish Congress Theodore Herzl Award recipient. Tonight, Henry returns to share his reflections on his friend and colleague, George Shulz. Please welcome warmly the 56th Secretary of State of the United States, Henry Kissinger.
Ron and friends, on this date, I was in New York with my parents, having just arrived from Germany 2 months earlier. My grandparents had to stay behind. My grandparents on my mother's side lived in a little village, and they were driven out of that village. My grandfather on my father's side lived in the town of Würzburg. He fled and found refuge in Sweden. And about 15 members of my family did not survive the sequence of events that started with his death. So that is something one can never forget. And I had the great pleasure of being able to stand for the principles that were being violated so brutally as Secretary of State in the United States. And through all the difficulties, I have never forgotten what America saved us from and how America is the residue of freedom in this world. During my governmental life, when people ask me what is something of which you're very proud, I often say my friendship with George Shulz. When I came to Washington, there was a whole range of problems in which I had no experience whatsoever. And through every year, George Shulz taught me about the energy crisis. He taught me about how to make decisions. And above all, he taught me the importance of standing for unshakable principles. The task of a statesman is to take his society from where it is to where it has never been. And act as a guide to answer a series of questions. Like, where are we? What are we trying to do? What should we be trying to do? And in this world today, we face an extraordinary turmoil. It has never happened before that every region of the world impacts every other region. It has never happened before that in different parts of the world, different revolutions are going on, but they are not of the same character. And of course, in the Middle East, which has to be our special concern. There is an upheaval against governments. There is a struggle between ethnic groups. There is a combat between religions. And there is an overall attack on Western values. And amidst all this turmoil, there is a small state, 50 miles in depth from the sea to its borders, that has to survive and prosper by relating itself to a concept of peace and order in the world, and to form alliances, above all with the United States, that is relevant not just to the immediate situation, but to its evolution. I go through this because in the nearly 40 years that I have known George Shulz, he has performed a leadership role in all of these concerns. In my experience, he was the first leader I knew that analyzed the nature of the energy crisis. He was the first cabinet member we had in the Nixon administration who took a trip to Israel, but not for any political reason. He went there to pay tribute to a young man who had died in the '67 war. And he thereby symbolized that the relationship between our countries was not simply a strategic one, but a moral and human one. He led the financial negotiations in 2 administrations. He identified terror as an overriding national issue and not just as a local issue way back in the '80s. And after he left government, at the Hoover Institute, when a new issue became barely visible on the horizon, he had the extraordinary, and continues to have, the extraordinary ability to bring together thoughtful people and sit them around the table and start a dialogue that calls attention to what we ought to do, what we ought to think about, and to do it in a personal manner that shows when he addresses a problem, he does not just see a theoretical issue, but he has the ability to translate it into a human necessity. So, at this moment in history, when the world is in turmoil, and when we need, at first, to deal with the manifestations of crisis, but beyond it, to develop a concept of order and purpose. And in a world in which Israel has to survive and cannot do it just by verbal assurances, but but best and only by becoming a part of a community dedicated to freedom. George is one of our great national assets. So Ron, let me thank you for giving me this opportunity to introduce a great man, a personal friend, whose conduct of policy and whose bearing as a human being is one of the great fortunes for the United States. And it's my honor to participate in giving this award to George Shulz.
Henry Kissinger and I have known each other since 1969, but I knew him earlier because we both were in Cambridge. I was at MIT, he was at Harvard. And I'd be reading these things that somebody named Kissinger wrote. I said, hey, the guy talks about the big picture in a meaningful way. So Henry is a formidable scholar, a beautiful writer, a teacher. His record as statesman is extraordinary. But I have seen on many occasions his intense patriotism. And he has a wonderful capacity for friendship, and I've been privileged to be his friend. So let's hear it once more for Henry. I'm really honored to have this opportunity to speak here. And you had a representative come out to Hoover and kind of coach me a little bit on what I should talk about. And the idea was Israel's economy and some interesting things that happened in the Soviet Jewry issues. And I'm going to mention those, but I feel tonight, with all things going on, I need to address myself to the region and what's happening and what I think should happen. So with the Israeli economy, it was interesting to me when I was Secretary of State. Prime ministers and foreign ministers would come and they'd talk about security issues, and I would tell them, look, you better watch your economy. And all of a sudden in the mid-'80s, the economy of Israel exploded into hyperinflation. Maybe you remember. It was terrific. So they came to me and said, okay, you warned us about this, now what should we do? So we had a general agreement of members of Congress and the American Jewish community and the Israeli government that I would be the heavy. I'd be the bad guy. I would say what you got to do. And I recruited Herb Stein and Stan Fisher to be my point men. And working with the Israeli government, we brought about the softest landing from hyperinflation that's on evidence anywhere in the world. It was a great performance. And the Israeli economy now is flourishing. But then there are the issues of Soviet Jewry. And President Reagan and I both cared a great deal about it. I remember one time President Reagan had the job of making movies of things that took place and showing them to the high brass to give them a better feel. And he told me that one time he saw pictures of the Holocaust. And he made the film, and then he said, I better keep a copy for myself, because this is so hard to imagine human beings could do anything like this, that people won't believe it. So I'm keeping this film to show them. He had that on his mind. And I remember one evening I brought Ambassador Dobrynin over to talk to him, and about a third of his time he spent on issues of Soviet Jewry. So Ambassador Dobrynin could feel that he understood the plight, he knew the people, he was very heavily invested in the subject, as was I. We finally had a great triumph with them being allowed to leave, but I remember vividly one evening we had a Seder in our embassy in Moscow, and when you go to something like that, you feel, well, here are these people that are repressed and not allowed to do what they want to do, not allowed to emigrate, and they must be kind of depressed. And you're going there to kind of buck them up and show them that somebody out in the world knows what's going on and cares. But the minute you get into their presence, you realize all of a sudden the motivation is entirely the other way around. And all of a sudden you say, here are these individual human beings that believe what they believe, that are going to do what they're going to do, and no big Soviet brutal state can change that. And it's inspirational to be in their presence. So I found the issues of dealing with Soviet Jewry were very inspiring to me for that reason. And I worked hard on one of the cases that I worked on was a woman named Ida Nudell. And I had done a variety of things, but it seemed hopeless, but I'd given her name to Shevardnadze in a special forum. And all of a sudden, I'm sitting in my office in the Department of State. Phone rings, pick it up. Little voice says, "This is Ida Nudell. I'm in Jerusalem. I'm home." I'll never forget it. It was the high point of my career as Secretary of State. But let me now say a few words about the region and what's going on, because I think it's a deeply threatening set of problems there, and Israel, I believe, is threatened. So let me start by outlining a kind of way of thinking about the subject. What do we need to do? First of all, we need to establish the fact that when we set out to do something, we, the United States, we can do it. And when we say we're going to do something, we do it. I remember in Marine Corps boot camp at the start of World War II, Sergeant hands me my rifle. He says, "Take good care of this rifle. This is your best friend. And remember one thing. Never point this rifle at anybody unless you're willing to pull a trigger. No empty threats." Boot camp wisdom. We have empty threats scattering the landscape. When you make empty threats, your credibility disappears. We've got to get our credibility back. We mean what we say, and we'll do what we're going to do. Then we have to be realistic. Let's look at that world. Let's take a look at Iran. What do you see when you look at Iran? You see, over an extended period, the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. Lots of lives have been lost with Iranian terrorism. You see a country that wants a ballistic missile. What do they want a ballistic missile for? You see a country who obviously wants to get a nuclear weapon. You see a country in which power is maintained by an execution policy for anyone who dissents that exceeds almost anybody's. So it's a cruel regime. And every other day they say they want to exterminate Israel. I think we should take them at their word. That's what they want to do. And so they have been in the Middle East. They're in Damascus. They're in Yemen. They're in Baghdad. Now they have been joined by Russian muscle. Hello, Shiites in Bahrain. Hello, Shiites in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. But also, hello, Israel. Here we have Hezbollah, let alone Hamas. But Hezbollah with lots of weaponry already deployed in southern Lebanon. And Iran, with its newly acquired wealth, will undoubtedly deploy more and more lethal weapons there. My impression is that Israel knows where they are going. The best defense you have against a missile is to hit it when it's still on the ground before it gets in the air. So what does Hezbollah do? They put the missiles in schools and hospitals and mosques. And then if you hit them, they say, war criminal. Let's get one thing clear. The party that puts weapons in civilian locations is the war criminal, not the party that knocks them out. So Israel will have to take steps, and there's no doubt about it. And we have to recognize that the war criminal is the country that puts the missiles in the civilian locations in the first place. Let's not make any difference about that. Now that we've confronted the reality, what do? Well, we need to buttress our strength. Let's get behind our military. Let's knock off this dumb sequester. It's the dumbest thing I ever heard of. Have legislation that says you've got to do everything proportionately. Are you crazy? Let's get rid of that. And let's build up, let's have a Ronald Reagan approach to putting our military where they need to be. And then we can exercise our diplomacy. We certainly ought to be able to organize a reasonable coalition of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, Israel. Wouldn't that be an interesting coalition? Maybe some of our European allies. And if we really mean it, we can be a leader who gets followed. And we can do something about the ISIS problem, and we can do something about the threat to Israel, and mean it, and get there. So those are things that we should be doing, in my opinion. And we can't stand idly by. The security and economic commons that was in the world when the Cold War ended was built with a lot of leadership from the United States. If the United States doesn't lead, we get chaos. Leading doesn't mean we send our troops everywhere in large numbers. We don't have to do that. I remember one time when I was in office, and the Iranians were playing around with Kuwaiti shipping. So we reflagged the ships to our flag. And when the president of Iran was somewhere making a speech saying the last thing Iran would do would be put a mine in the Persian Gulf, our Navy was taking pictures of them doing it. We boarded the ship. We took off some mines for evidence. We took off the sailors. We sank the ship. We took the sailors to Dubai and said to the Iranians, come and get your sailors and cut it out. So we exposed their lie. We let them know we knew what's going on, and we let them know their consequences, and they cut it out. So we've got to mean what we say, and we've got to do things that say to our adversaries, there are consequences, big-time consequences when you cross us and our friends. So let me now tell one story in conclusion that illustrates what we need so badly. We had been working with the Israelis and the Jordanians, and King Hussein was very much, it seemed to me, of a mood that, yes, he's willing to sit down with the Israelis and negotiate an agreement. But he kept saying, I have to have an international umbrella under which to negotiate. So we had the idea, well, the Reagan-Gorbachev summit in Washington is going to occur pretty soon. Wouldn't that be a great umbrella? So I pitched the idea to President Reagan, and he said, well, okay, but first you have to go to Israel. If they say okay, then you have to go to King Hussein. If he says okay, then you have to go to Gorbachev. So I set out for Israel. And that was the time when we had the two-headed government. Peres was foreign minister and Shamir was the prime minister. So I wrote out very carefully what I was going to say so nobody could say I said something different to one or the other. First I went to Peres and he said, I agree, but I won't say anything because if I say yes publicly, Shamir will probably say no. So he said, you've got me in your pocket, but I won't say anything. So then I talked to Shamir and he thinks about it and says, well, we'll consider it. So it was arranged that I went off to the Weizmann Institute during the day. My staff was working on this issue. And it was arranged that Shamir and I would have a private dinner to talk about the Soviet Jewry issues. And then after that, there'd be a general meeting of everybody, and he would give his answer. So I'm about to go to the dinner, and somebody says, we're either going to have a long evening or a short evening. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, if he says no, it's a short evening. If he says yes, we'll be up all night negotiating MOUs and side letters and whatnot. I said, well, so be it. So I go over, and we have a very warm, nice dinner, helpful for my trip to coming to Moscow. And then we go to the general meeting, and everybody is there, and Shamir sort of pulls himself up, and he says, Mr. Secretary, you know our dreams. You know our nightmares. We trust you. Go ahead. That was it. We trust you. So we had built a relationship of trust. And in these difficult times, trust is the coin of the realm, and we need to rebuild it. And this organization, from all I can see, is helping to do that. And it's something that we must do. We have to have a relationship of trust and common interest with our friends in Israel. God bless.